Hi, welcome to Fiberchats. My name is Irina. I'm the host here, and my guest today is the creator of a blog called Knitted Bliss, Julie Crawford. Welcome.
Thanks. I'm so pleased to be here, Irina, and it's always so nice to see you.
It's really nice to have you on my channel. We hung out at H&H together and we've met in Toronto. Well, besides having a blog, and we'll come back to the blog and what made you decide to start it, you also a knitwear designer and embroidery designer. So let's go like way back. When did all this fiber goodness became part of your life?
Oh, like many people, I had a very crafty grandmother. And so I learned a lot of crafts when I was a child. I learned to knit then. I learned to do cross stitch. In particular, I did a lot of cross stitch when I was a kid, rug hooking, with the latch, doing a lot of that kind of stuff. Silk flower arranging, putting flowers on straw hats and putting that on your wall was a big thing back then. Maybe it was just my grandmother. I don't know. And so I really developed a lot of love of crafting in general during that time. And that's when I developed a lot of those skills. And then when I was older, when I was a teenager, like I'd still knit here and there, the odd garter stitch scarf. But I lived abroad for a couple of years in my early 20s in Istanbul, and Turkish knitting is spectacular. And when I saw it there and saw some of the yarn shops, I was like, I remember knitting. I know how to knit. And so like I got some needles and some yarn while I was there, and I just look online and I just kind of picked it back up again and then really expanded my skill set from there. It was this was also around the time too in the early 2000s where knitting blogs were starting to become a big deal, especially before Ravelry. So I've been doing this a really long time because I remember pre-Ravelry knitting blogs that were so inspiring and it really made me want to like upgrade my skills. And so I did. And then of course, with the advent of Ravelry, where suddenly you could see so much more, and it provided that kind of social hub for a lot of things too. So then I had a regular feature on my knitting blog called Modification Mondays, where I would highlight different a pattern, and then a knitter who had taken that pattern and made something completely different with it, like really changed it up to make it their own. And I ran that for a really long time. And I stopped, not because I wanted to, but because like Instagram really took over as a micro blogging kind of platform, and people spent less time posting about their projects on Ravelry and more so on Instagram. But then it was harder to find details on how people have made modifications or even to find them at all. And so I had to slow down that piece of it during that time. And I do think Instagram has sort of created a real microblogging kind of climate for so many fiber artists and crafters and makers.
Well, when you talk about Instagram, do you see it as a place to find new ideas, inspirations? Do you see it as like a social hub to meet and talk to other people? Is it marketing tool? Is it a hustle? Like, what is it for?
It's a hassle. No, I love it. I hate it. My relationship with Instagram feels very complicated. I think that's true for a lot of people who have a small business that relies on Instagram in terms of a marketing tool, but also uses it beyond that. Like I absolutely use it to connect with friends and see what people are doing. And because I also sell products like the embroidery kits, the embroidery stick and stitch so people can embroider their knitting patterns. Like I love it when people tag me and I get to see what they've made. Like it's that part's really incredible and otherwise like would be very difficult to do. And so I love those pieces of it. But some of the parts I really hate, of course, are the same things we all hate, where it really throttles. Instagram really prevents people from seeing like just that timeline feed that we all really wanted, that classic Instagram feed where it was just like, just show me in a timeline in chronological order. Because every now and then I'll think of somebody, and it doesn't mean I know them in real life, but I'll be like, what's that? I haven't seen anything from that maker in a little while. Is she not posting these days? And I'll click over onto her account and no, I've just missed the last, I don't know, 18 posts, right? And it's like, oh, that's too bad. Like, how do I get more of this in my feed. So that part gets really annoying because if it's happening for me, I'm sure it's happening for others. And but I also really enjoy seeing what my friends are doing, right? Like, and you know, especially too in the DMs, like sometimes we're just sending each other voice notes and stuff like that, and that can be really fun. And just to be able to kind of have those conversations on the side and to see what people are making and doing. I mean, there's no shortage of inspiration in the world. And sometimes too now with Instagram, it's like, okay, there's inspiration, but then like, is it real or is it AI? What am I looking at? That part's starting to get a little murky these days, and I don't love that. Some of it's really obvious and some of it's not. So, you know, like that part I don't love. But you know, I think with Instagram and getting inspired off of Instagram, you have to make a point to not get overwhelmed and just look at pretty pictures, you know, like to be like, yeah, you know what? I'm going to give that a go. I'm going to try that.
Well, talking
That's
about
important.
giving something a go, it's one thing to need something and like get better at that. It's whole other concept of combining embroidery and knitting. And it's really hot right now. Like a lot of people that for guests of my channels are doing it. You are a pro at this. Tell me like how that idea came to you and like when did you first combine embroidery and knitting?
Oh, yes. You know what? Honestly, I think I actually embroidered a pair of mittens like when I was 20. I just decided to stick some flowers on it and it looked really 70s because I hadn't considered like how thick the yarn was that I was using on the knit that I was embroidering and like going over it too many times. And they became kind of really, they were awkward. They were pretty amateurish, but it was still like a neat idea at the time. And I did know how to embroider. And then I picked up an embroidery kit very randomly, just off of Etsy. I'm going to say 2018-ish, and was like, oh yeah, I remember how to do this. This is great. And I really enjoyed doing that. Fast forward to the pandemic, and I had left my job that I had had rolling into the pandemic. I was working full time. I had two young kids, and you know, like that was a weird time, and it kind of felt like the end of the world, basically. And I, after a couple of months of kind of just making some adjustments, and I was like, okay, I want to do like something that is my own business that gives me the flexibility to be able to care for my kids during whatever is happening right now in the world. And I'm already very connected with this fiber world, but you know, lots of people were already, say, dyeing yarn or pattern designing. And I'm not saying that there isn't room for more dyers or pattern designers. Absolutely, especially if somebody's got a particular angle and something new that they're offering. But I was like, you know, I love embroidery and I love knitting. What if I did like knitting themed embroidery? And so that's really where I went with it. I talked to a couple of close friends about that and was like, hey, if I decided to do this, what do you think? And they were like, we've been waiting for you to do something like this for years. Where have you been? Like, why have you not been doing this? And I was like, okay, so I'm going to run with that. So I started designing some knitting themed like embroidery hoops and stuff like that, where I'd sketch them out literally pencil and paper and then like translate them into graphics and stuff like that to print them out. And then also started designing onto with same thing, sketching it out to this dissolving stabilizer that I really like. It washes away, but it has a sticky back. So you pre-print the designs and then you peel off the back and you stick it on your knit. And it's like adult coloring with thread. You just kind of fill in the shapes, either with like, this one is done with fingering, but also lace weight yarns can be great. Embroidery floss works brilliantly, you know, and that part just got super addictive because then I was able to take a look at like some items that I had knit that I was kind of like, meh, it's all right. And then I embroidered them. And then suddenly it was like, whoa, this is a wonderful piece. And I'm excited to wear this. And it made sort of like upcycling some of those knits I had, you know, really exciting. And it made it feel really something very special and very unique.
Well, when you do the embroidery, do you design the piece from get-go, knit it, and then embroider it? Or like, do you expect people to just put it on whatever sweater they have, like can be machine made, store-bought, and embroider that? Like what's in your view, like how you want to go?
Oh, I mean, absolutely. You can embroider anything at all. And like, absolutely, if you have a store-bought sweater kicking around or a store-bought cardigan and it's feeling really blah, I've absolutely embroidered on that and been like, oh yeah, now it's fabulous. Now I want to wear it. Um, in terms of designing now, I do think a bit about that, but it's not the only way that I design knitting patterns, like just being like, okay, but can they embroider this? It's like, I think that it's one of those things where it's awesome. And honestly, you can probably embroider any knit if you have your mind to it. Like, even if it's lace, sure, you would just have to be more careful about how you're tucking in your threads on the backside, but you could still do that, right? Or embroidering over cables, that can be really interesting too if you're incorporating in and around the shapes. There's so much extra creativity and room to play with that. So I wouldn't say I design with embroidering that item to be the end goal every time, but I've definitely developed some that are specifically for that. I have a fingerless mitt pattern that's done very specifically as a simple chevron design. And then the idea is that, like, on the pattern, there's a link to a video. I'll send you a photo and you can pop it in. That is like, shows you exactly, we're threading the needle. We're starting from the absolute beginning. We're talking about exactly how to be filling in those shapes. And so, those things I think can really help people who are embroidery curious get on board in a low stakes way, right? And when I teach classes for embroidery on knits, like, I often have people like just bring in like a sample, like a swatch, right? Like, if you've got a swatch kicking around and you're not feeling super confident about your embroidery skills, like, a swatch is a great way to go. Then it feels low stakes and people can develop their skills and feel, although I will say this, every time I do teach a class, without fail, someone always says, oh my gosh, that was so much easier than I thought it was going to be. Because embroidery actually is so much easier than it looks. It really is.
The first time I came to, when I met you, it was at some sort of yarn fair. There was like you were selling your kits. And I remember looking at it and I'm thinking like, oh my God, like, this is so incredible, because it is basically you stick it on and then you can it doesn't require that level of like freehand skills that like we think of embroidery, right? But you had all those little loops hanging on the wall. And I remember asking you, like, when you do embroidery on a sweater or on mittens, do you have to have it in the hoop? Do you have to stretch it? And you said no. Like, talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, that's this is like, man, I feel like I bang this drum all the time when I talk to people specifically about it, because we all have seen those Instagram posts where someone's put out this beautiful flat lay and they've got like a sweatshirt or a sweater and they have it in a hoop, in an embroidery hoop, and they're embroidering something sort of in process on it. And I'm always like, no, don't do that. Stop showing people these embroidery hoops like this. If you're going to embroider, and I have done this for samples for booths when I do fairs, if you're going to embroider something that's going to stay in a hoop, by all means, pop it in a hoop. But for something, particularly a knit fabric, why I'm against it is because knit fabrics are so stretchy, right? And so what's the first thing you do when you pop a fabric into an embroidery hoop? You start pulling on the fabric to make it tight. So it kind of has like a drum-like texture for you to embroider on. If you do that with a stretchy knit and you've stretched it out and then you embroider on it and you pop it out of its hoop, your embroidery is going to be all wonky. It won't be aligned where you think it's going to be. The stitches are going to be odd and uneven, and it just won't. I mean, which isn't to say every single time that will happen. If you manage to put your fabric in and you don't have it super tight in the hoop and somehow you haven't pulled on any of it, like, you might get lucky. You could be fine. But generally speaking, I advise against it because of that. And because I use the dissolving stabilizer, what I find is that gives you the surface that you need. And so I literally will just hold it just like this, no hoop, and I will stitch exactly like this. The stabilizer gives it enough that you don't need to worry about it being all over the place. And then I find it just helps to position and lock in your embroidery on your sweater or knitted item so much better. And the results are so much more consistent and just better. I mean, I learned the hard way. I did a sweater once, early days, and it was a store-bought one. And it was actually it was a commissioned piece that was specifically about raising awareness for homelessness in Toronto. And they wanted to have like a statistic embroidered across the front. I was like, yeah, no problem. I got this. Popped it into a hoop like I had seen so many people do, embroidered it all, and then popped it out. And all of those letters were all over the place because, of course, I pulled the fabric, right? And so then I had to cut all of those stitches out, try it again. And it just like, I did it. I met my deadlines. Everything was fine in the end. But it was just like, there was also a city skyline, same thing, right? Like it just pulls it. The stitches are distorted. They don't look the way they should, you know? So it's so much easier to use the stabilizer without the hoop on a knit. If it's store-bought or hand knit, I say the same thing every time. The other thing that can happen too is hoop burn, which means like if you've over tightened the hoop, you know how there's like the inner and the outer, sometimes it will just cause so much damage to those fibers, particularly if it's sitting there for a long time, that even after you wash it, you'll still have a little line from the hoop. No one wants that.
I didn't think about that, but yeah, that makes sense. Is there like how many things did you learn from trying and error? Like, is it still like that, or like are you a total pro by now? There is nothing that can trick you anymore.
Well, the fun thing is I do get to say I'm a pro because I do it professionally, right? And I genuinely do it professionally. And I would say some things are trial and error, and some things now are just like a best practice, like the way that you go forward. I will say that, you know, because it's easier than it looks, you tend to have a lot of like, I have my favorite stitches, the ones that bring me the most joy, that I enjoy stitching. And sometimes that's different for other people, right? Like some people hate French knots, and like, I totally get that. Learning to do French knots feels really intimidating. I have a really easy way to do it. It involves both hands. And so whenever I teach that bit, you know, people are always like, oh, that does make it easier. Okay. You know, so those sorts of pieces. But yeah, I mean, a lot of that stuff is trial and error as you go, and it gets easier all the time. But now it's pretty easy. Now the hardest thing I think is just like picking colors, you know.
That, well, because like I'm doing a Fair Isle piece.
Hmm.
And it's difficult technically. There was like no, you know, there was like 4 sticks in that one sweater. So I mean, it's difficult. There is lace, there is Fair Isle. The most difficult thing about that sweater was to pick 10 colors.
10. Ooh, yeah.
Like it killed me. Like I spent like hours in that store with like everybody recommending different things, and to choose the final colors was like the most difficult thing out of that whole thing. So like I imagine for embroidery to pick the right colors and stop at certain number of colors, right? Because you don't want to sometimes overpower your needs.
Oh, absolutely. And I actually think about that when I'm designing an embroidery design to go on knits, or even for the hoops as well. It's like, okay, we can't have 20 colors here. That's exhausting. And it just adds to the supplies then that you need, which nobody wants to do that, right? Nobody wants to be off trying to find all these different things. So I do try and think about like limiting the color palette to a certain extent, being able to suggest alternative colors and stuff if people have some different ideas. You know, if they say, oh, you know, I hate blue or whatever, and it's like, that's fine. There's lots of other colors. And I think that can make things look so different, right? Just your color choices alone, it's such a big difference. I have an embroidery design that I've done a couple of times, and then I did decide to do on felt the same design for a Christmas ornament, and then I just did it in Christmas colors, you know, just reds and greens and stuff like that. And it looks completely different than it did when I did it in blues on mittens, right? Like your color choices are such a huge part of the process.
One time, like when I first started knitting, like I was just learning how to knit, I decided to make a mosaic shawl, and it turned out beautiful. But like when I was blocking it, I didn't know anything about blocking at this point. So I just stretched it somewhat on the blocking mats, and it wasn't the best blocking job. It was like a little wonky. And I posted an update on Instagram, and the designer saw it. And she was like, maybe you can reblock it a little bit to make it a little straighter. And I was like, oh my God, I just ruined her design. Do you ever get the feeling when you see other people like using your designs on their needs and you're like, oh no, like what did you do there?
Um, I think only one time so far. I would say the biggest thing has to do with like how thick the thread or the yarn is that you're using, right? So, on this sample here, this is done with lichen and lace embroidery yarn, which is like a lace weight yarn. So the results are great, and I sell like the needles that are specifically for it. The chenille needles, which are great for embroidering on knits, they have a big eye, and they're thicker like a tapestry needle, but they have a really sharp tip, which is what you want, because when you're embroidering on knits, you want to go straight through the knit fabric. You're not working around the stitches. You're going right through. So sometimes I've seen people using like really thick yarn or the entire strand of thread, but on a really small needle, and just not quite understanding like that's too much, or they're over layering in that one spot. But most of the time I'm actually wildly impressed. I actually find like I've seen very adventurous beginners being like, this is going to be my first embroidery project, and they knock it out of the park. They've never embroidered before, and I really love that. And it just makes me so happy to see how like 99.9% of the time there's huge success. And inside every one of my patterns, there's always a web link that gives you like additional photos, suggested stitching orders, video clips, different things to help support. So anytime I've heard of anyone having an issue, the first thing I always say is, did you go to the web page? And they're like, oh, no, I didn't. And I'm like, okay, that's the first step, right? Because like, if you're not an experienced embroiderer, then you'll want to see more close-ups. You'll want to hear things like suggested stitching order, you'll want to have some of those tips and tricks, right? But I mean, everyone's a rock star with it. Like embroidery really is easier than people think. And they rock it every time.
What came first? Did you become an instructor in this first, or did you start the business first?
I had taught some knitting classes beforehand. And I did have a class that I used to teach. I'm actually going to be teaching it again for the first time in like at least a few years, called How to Photograph Your Knits. And the Instagram trends have kind of come and gone to a certain degree, but I do think people universally want to know how to feel more comfortable when they're having photos taken of themselves, and also to be able to articulate how they want that photo to be taken, how to take photos by yourself with nobody else, which can often make people who are uncomfortable having their photo taken feel a lot more comfortable. And then also too, if you're taking photos of like a knitting buddy, how can you help your friend be more comfortable? How do you capture that to the best angles? We also do things like flat lace. And so when I teach it in person, I tell people like, bring 2 or 3 items, let's get them photographed. So people actually leave with really good photos of the thing that they brought. And what's interesting about this, it's all done with smartphones, is that, I think when people see the process of that, they can get a lot more comfortable with experimenting. But, I actually take a lot of photos myself, even of myself. And I do it often either with like my phone on a timer, or I have a little camera remote as well. And, and that can really help, because then did you feel kind of dumb striking a pose? Well, who's going to know? Nobody. Was the photo a disaster? Delete. It's gone. Never existed. But in there, you take enough photos, there's gold. Absolutely. And then I think people feel more comfortable sharing their stuff on social media, or if they want to branch out into designing, they feel more comfortable taking photos of the elements that they want to highlight in that design. So I really got deep on that class. I love that class. And so I did do some teaching before then. So with the embroidery, it's been really great to be able to add that as well. And there's been a lot of demand for those sorts of classes, which is fantastic. And I do have a completely remote, in your living room, in your pajamas, at your own schedule, on demand, how to embroider your knits workshop. And it's like over 2 hours. It's all time stamped, and it's like suitable for absolute beginners. You know, we're separating the threads, we're threading the needle, we're talking about, you know, how to do this stitch or that stitch, how to fix common errors as they come up, right? Like your thread will snag sometimes. That's inevitable. It's going to happen. How do we fix it when it happens, right?
Oh, that's a great class. I actually should take it because it's funny because like I did some embroidery over the years. Like my grandma was big on embroidery, so she taught me some basics, and then I did cross stitching for a few years, like in my 30s. So it's would be interesting for me to take a look at this class. I'll do that. I'll take that class.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you.
It's great. So how did you decide to go into business and start selling kits? And was it difficult to come up with the kits and to manufacture it all and package it all and all of that things? Like, was that more difficult than you expected?
Um, yes and no. I think one of the advantages I had is because I'd already been involved in the knitting community for so long. I already had lots of contacts. So when I was looking to start it as a business, I'm like, okay, how do I get this piece? How do I do this? How do I wholesale? What are the companies that are wholesaling, right? I knew who I could ask, and then I was able to get different pieces of information that helped me pull it together, right? Like, and again, like I can't emphasize enough how fortunate I was to already be looking to do something in an industry I was already heavily active in, right? Like if I just picked up knitting and just picked up embroidery in the last 3 years, and I was starting to build an Instagram following or something from absolute scratch, yeah, it would be so much harder. It's not impossible. Absolutely not. But it's just harder, you know? And I think that for any new businesses that are like, you know, yeah, I want to do something like that too, I'd say, you know, it's really just a matter of like sticking with it and really sort of growing that audience over time, because it does take years, right? Like, I don't think you can start a business and 6 months later, at least not in the crafting world. I don't know, maybe someone can. And 6 months later be like, woo, my first $1 million year. It's like, that's great, but that's not realistic. That's not a typical journey for a small business. And especially like in this economy, right? You know, like all over the world, the cost of living has been increasing dramatically, and people are readjusting their budgets. And while knitting and embroidery brings so much joy and mental health and like, you know, some really good vibes and friends for a lot of people, it doesn't mean it's free, right? And so, you know, I really love to emphasize being able to use the materials that you have if you want to be able to do that kind of stuff. And that's the thing I like about embroidering on knits, is that it's not like, okay, you have to knit something entirely brand new so that you can embroider on it, and you can only use these wildly expensive things. It's like, no, you can use that store-bought sweater that's been sitting in the back of your closet that you're kind of on, and you can just go to your Michael's or Joann's or whatever and get some DMC embroidery floss and pick a few colors that you like and just crack on. And I think that that helps give people the confidence to help transform maybe some of their existing knits or their existing wardrobes into things that bring them joy.
Well, tell me, like, tell my viewers about what they can expect in a kit. Like, if they purchase a kit from you, what comes in the kit and what kind of extra instructions can they hope for?
Okay. So I basically have two major types of kits. One is like for a hoop. So this one is the I got you something. And it comes in a white background and a lilac background. And because it has a human hand, anytime there's a human element, I include extra threads for customizing some skin tones. So you can choose for the skin tone for the hand as well. And then we've got this, like, I don't know if you can see, but there's this chain stitch sweater sleeve for it. That's the little knitting element that's in this one. So what you get in that kit is you get the stainless steel embroidery needles, the instruction sheet, you get all of the DMC threads in those colors that you need to stitch it. You get the embroidery hoop. The design is pre-printed on organic cotton. You get, and on the instruction sheet, there's a link to a web page that's got like close-up photos, suggested stitching order, those sorts of things to help. You also get a needle threader and a magnetic needle minder, because I wanted to have like a really giftable kit, something that felt very special when you had it, that it felt like it was, you know, I wrap it in tissue paper, and I'm not the world's best tissue paper wrapper. I feel like some kits are nicer done than others. I'm just like, oh, even though I'm the only one who does it. But it's got everything that you need for the embroidery hoop kits. All the kits are like that. For embroidering on knits, what these kits are is that you get an instruction sheet with a link to a web page, because I'm all about that. And you get like the directions for it, and the design is pre-printed on a dissolving stabilizer. So the dissolving stabilizer I like to use is a sulky, sticky Fabri-Solvi. I don't know why they named it this. This is an awkward name. And basically what it is it's like, you can draw on it, you can print on it, and then you basically just cut around the shape you want. You figure out where you want to put it on your knit, and then you peel off the back and you stick it down, and you stitch right through it. You stitch right through this like flexible fabric sticker, and you just fill in the shapes. And then when you're all done embroidering, it washes away underwater. So those kits don't have, say, the threads. They're obviously at a different price point. It is just that. And so those ones are great for people who want to be upcycling their wardrobe or doing some embroidery. Maybe they've got threads or leftover yarns that they want to be using at home. And that's also an option. I do have, like, in my shop, both online and when I do shows, little pre-arranged floss palettes. I've got a few different options for people who are like, I don't have any embroidery floss. I don't want to put colors together. I want it to look exactly like that. And then it's like, great, don't worry, I got you. Here are the options. Here are the things that I've done as well. So just to try and meet people with a couple of different options for where they want to be in their journey, right? Do you already have the needles? Then you don't need to buy the needles, right? So embroidering on knits, it's more a la carte. But for the embroidery hoops with the little sweaters, then those are very giftable, and like everything you need is in there.
Do you think children can use those kits as well, or is it like designed for adults?
Technically and legally for adults, but I mean, that's because anything that you're marketing to children, of course, I think there's particular regulations about it has to be approved through various government regulations for suitability for children for particular ages. So I'm not going to do that. That costs thousands and thousands of dollars for each individual country. But if you've got a crafty kid that you know can like sew a felt shape or something like that, and they love embroidery, by all means, they could do these for sure. It's really just about whether or not you feel that the child in question is comfortable using a sewing needle, a sharp-tipped sewing needle. And if you feel good about that, then they're good.
How do you come up with the designs for embroidery?
They often come to me and then I just start sketching them out. So at the beginning, when I first started in 2020, it was like pencil and paper, but now I have Procreate, and so I got an iPad and I've got the Procreate app, and I draw straight on the tablet. And so that just helps shorten some of the distance between the design idea and actually getting it onto fabric. It still takes a long time. Some of them come together really quickly and some of them take forever. So this one here is like a bunch of little dogs and sweaters, and I have a cat one too. And each one of these dogs takes time to draw. And then I learned that, like, man, I don't actually know how to draw curly-haired dog breeds very well. So there aren't any curly-haired dog breeds on this because that was taking a while. And so it's different things like that, right? Like in terms of how intricate the design is and how long it takes to do. Some of them have come together really quickly, and that's a really great feeling. And other times I know they take longer. And then so even for like the dogs and the sweaters and their counterpart, the cats and sweaters. Okay, so you have not just the cats and the dogs that are all a little bit different. They're all wearing a little different sweater. So then you're designing that little sweater as well, right? And then in stitching it, and like they're tiny. So, you know, there's various elements to consider when doing those. And I do like having them like printed in the full color because I think that helps give people a really easy way to start, right? And it's also really hard to mess up then. I just moved house a couple of weeks ago, so I'm sort of in the middle of a couple of other designs that just sort of like are on pause because I can't find half the things I wish to find. A lot of times they just come to me and I'm like, that seems like a fun idea, or that could work. And then I start sketching them out. And then I usually print them out. I always do a test print at home because oftentimes what happens is you have to be very careful about the elements. Sometimes things are too small and then they're not fun to stitch. But if they're too big, is that really going to work with the overall composition? So I always have to print them out to sort of say, okay, like, let's give this a test run. How does this actually feel to stitch? And I do it for both, like for designs on knitting and for the hoops, because the experience is such an important part of it. You want to enjoy the craft.
Well, you mentioned that you are the one woman show. If there was some tasks that you could give to others to do, what would those be?
I do sometimes. I have a test stitcher. So she does a great job where I can give her stuff and just sort of say like, hey, I've got this kit that I'm working on. I just need, like, first of all, for these ones, is there enough floss? Do we have enough floss? You know, are we getting too low on anything? Or for the embroidery on knits ones, you know, like, here's some colors, but you pull together a palette, see how you feel about like how this layout works for you, you know, and that's really helpful to get that kind of feedback. But the part that actually takes the most is literally just the physical assembly, right? I mean, it would be great if somebody would just automatically reorder things as I'm running low. I'd love to have like a better inventory system, because I'll be like, oh yeah, I've got lots of things for that kit. And then I'll be looking at it and saying, oh, I'm out of the instruction sheets. I got to print more of the instruction sheets. And I don't print those at home. I get them printed because they're like full color printing. And so it's like, okay, I got to send those for printing. And, you know, is it a rush job and I'm going to Staples because I really need this right now? Or do I have a few days, in which case I use a local printer, you know, better costs, supporting local, those things.
Well, now that it's like became your full-time job, do you ever question your sanity of starting this whole thing?
No, actually, I feel really fortunate because I love doing this, and it's kind of hot right now, which is a real advantage. And like, nothing lasts forever, right? You know, I'm not saying no one will embroider and knit 20 years from now, but it might not be as interesting to people as it is right now, right? And I think sort of in the evolution that I've had in this industry, right? Like, where I used to be a very established knit blogger in that time when knit blogs were a big deal, right? And that was a big thing. And, you know, moving more then into like designing and stuff like that. And now with the embroidery on knits, right? You know, I don't know. Is this something I'd still be doing in 20 years? Like, I love doing this. I would absolutely still do this in 20 years, but, you know, maybe that's not what the landscape of the knitting world is going to look like then. And maybe it's going to be something else. And maybe I will have evolved with that, you know, because I do think that's part of the journey, right? Or, you know, I've seen plenty of people say, it's been good, but I also just want to not do this as a business. And I just want to do it for my own enjoyment. I've seen people go that way too. It's hard to predict the future. I don't know.
Well, when I visited Toronto and we went for that breakfast, so Mary Martin was the one that introduced us basically, and
I love Mary. She's the best.
She's wonderful. So we talked about, I gave both of you sort of an elevator speech about why you should come to HH Americas, and you both came and you both enjoyed it. But tell me, like, your variation of the spiel, like, why would somebody need to come to HH Americas? What did you get out of it? What made you enjoy it? Who did you meet, and do you think you're gonna come again sometime?
Going to H&H Americas was fascinating because I'd heard of it before, the one that's in Germany, right? And I was just like, oh, wow, that's so amazing. That must be so inspiring. And so when I met you, when you were talking about it, and then afterwards, Mary and I are like, I don't know, should we go? Should we do this? Maybe. All right, let's do it. And I went in like with a pretty open mind. I was looking to expand into, because I do wholesale for some yarn stores in the US, because I didn't really know a lot of those stores. I don't travel to the US very often. And so it was really nice to be able to meet a variety of people, other American designers. There were so many great groups. And I mean, just the energy alone, right? Like everyone's there in such a positive mindset, and it just felt really great. There were so many inspiring things, like, you know, in terms of the quilting and the crochet and, you know, the sewing. And then there was also really interesting conversations with people who in other companies that have like different products that can help me, right? Like, oh, you know, there's these really interesting hoop frames. Maybe hoop frames would be a cool product to add to it as well, right? Or, you know, that sulky Fabrisolvi that I use, sometimes it's out of stock. And it's like, okay, but there's these other companies that make a basically identical product to that. So like, how can I then develop a relationship there, right? Or meeting other designers. And this past summer, actually, meeting Jen from One Wild Designs at one of the events at H&H, we decided to collaborate this summer and do a make along. So using one of her knitting patterns, and it's actually this one, I'm wearing it right now. So this is her soft walk tank top pattern. And so from One Wild Designs, what they emphasize on is having customized fit, right? And so being able to really get those well-fitting garments that are specific for your body type. And I really liked that. And so I have recently just designed this Easy Daisy one, because sometimes people are like, I really want to try this, but I feel really intimidated and I'm worried I'm going to suck. And I'm like, you're not going to suck, first of all, but you know, sometimes something feeling a little easier. So the daisies are super easy. And it's like one type of stitch that like I have video tutorials through it as well. It's literally just one type of stitch. And so you just sort of like cut them out and you figure out some placements. And we did a whole make along where people could sign up. And then we had like video drop-ins. There's a Slack channel where we've been chatting and showing photos. It's just been really fun to kind of see like the different ways people are putting things on it. They're doing like maybe a spray across here, or they're doing at the hem, or just a neckline, or they're putting it on a t-shirt. And, you know, that was something that's been super fun this summer that never would have happened if I hadn't gone to H&H, right? And yeah, there's so many. Actually, I probably have to follow up with a lot of people at the end of the season as well, now that I think of it. You know, in terms of just like, oh yeah, hey, how did that go? We talked about something in the fall. Here's the fall. It's rolling around. Let's chat. So, you know, I think a lot of those connections and relationships are really great. I would say what's crazy is I was there, I think, the entire time, and it still felt like there wasn't enough time.
Yeah, I know. Like, and I was at the show basically like from 7 in the morning, getting up, just grabbing coffee and like being there until it was dark again, and had the best time.
Yeah, it was great. Oh, you did that amazing interview with that young quilter, and that was fantastic. I loved catching that on the main stage. You were fantastic.
Thank you. Thank you. It was Genesis. She's the 14-year-old quilter. Yeah.
Yeah.
It was a great
Quilting is something I would love to do if I ever found that I could develop a superpower where I didn't need to sleep, but everyone else still needs to sleep.
I know. You know what? It's frustrating. Like I need more hours in the day to be able to
Right?
some sort. Like I'm very, very tempted to learn how to weave. I
That would
told
be
my
so
husband, I
cool.
was like, we now empty nesters, we have room. I can put a huge weaving press. And he was like, no, go somewhere and like learn how to do it someplace
Oh, you're
else.
going to get a loom room, a room for your loom. I love it. You should do that.
Right?
Yeah.
That's the best thing about having like friends who are crafters, because you totally get me. You understand me. Like it's immediately, yes, you should do it, of course.
Absolutely. You're interested. You weren't just interested for 5 minutes. You've been thinking about this for a while.
And I have yarn already, so it's going to be the use of my yarn. You know, it goes faster.
It uses up yarn so much faster. Absolutely. Oh,
So
sounds good.
I I had such fun talking to you today, and I hope we could get to hang around sometime soon, either
Absolutely.
Canada or in the US, or maybe we'll travel somewhere together. It's
Oh,
all.
that would be fun.
Thanks so much, Julie. Thank you for
Thank
being.
you, Irina. This was great.